Grazie, Presidente. Grazie, Walter. Well, I will go on in English for our friend Fujung, and the conference will be in English. And President Tega is expressed to our pride for having Fujung as a member of our academy, the first Chinese member in the long, long history of our academy, and probably, as Mr. Tega said, the first Chinese member of an Italian important academy. There are not so many important academies in Italy. And I wish to remind, especially to the members of the academy, of whom Curzio is one, of course, Scazzieri and several others who are following this meeting, that Professor Fujung has proposed an agreement between the Peking University and the Accademia delle Scienze for a program of visiting professors from our academy to Beijing. Very generous program, entirely financed by Professor Fujung and the Peking University, which I think has no comparison with any other academic program of exchange between China and Italy. So we are so glad, and we hope this pandemic is over. First, for having you in Bologna. Well, you came in Bologna, actually, just for a visit before the pandemic. So after the pandemic, you will come again here for more strict contact, and with this program of visiting professors from Bologna Academy of Sciences to Peking University can be implemented finally in the best way. We hope, we are really, we expect a lot from this program because it's top program. My duty is first to present Professor Fujung in a proper way. In a proper way will mean spending all the time we have, so I will be very short. But hope to see Professor Fujung got his PhD from Harvard, he's professor of political economy and public policy at both the National School of Development and the School of Government, and he's the academic dean of Institute of South-South Cooperation and Development at the Peking University. He has previously served as executive dean of the School of Government at the Peking University. There is no need to remind that the Peking University is the oldest university of China and is ranked 25 in the world amongst the universities. I'm afraid my university, della Sapienza, which is a good university, is around 150. And Bologna is more or less, we are fighting between Bologna and Sapienza for the first place in Italy. So Peking University is not just an old university, it's a very, very high-ranking university. And I wish to remind, in particular, the South-South Institute, which was created by Professor Fujung, and is so important that President Xi Jinping went to visit it. It is an institute marvelous as a setting, and it's taking graduate students from all the part of the south of the world and came to Beijing to learn about development, techniques, and so on. I had the privilege of visiting, giving a lecture there, and I can tell you it's a so beautiful institution. And so we hope to cooperate as soon as this pandemic is over. In the meantime, we to cooperate in this way. And since we have three eminent economists here, we had the idea of making this very general title about models and evidence in economics where we are, because from time to time, it's important to go back to the fundamentals because you need applied economics, but you need theoretical economics for doing good applied economics. I wish to remind what Louis Pasteur used to say, the great French scientist. There is no applied science. There are only applications of science. And I think in economics, this is true exactly as it is in physics or in biology. So we shall have first the lecture of Professor Fujung, then Roberto Scazzieri will follow, And then, of course, the closing is by Professor Alberto Quadrio Curzio. Thank you again for being here. The floor is yours. Let me say 25 minutes, more or less 30 minutes. If you take more, it's not important.
Okay, I will try to be brief so that we have more time for discussions. Angelo, thank you very much for your very generous introduction. And I wish I could be there physically, not virtually. And I love every part of Italy. I have been to your country many, many times, often attending conferences organized by the Aspen Institute. And as a kid, I learned a lot about Italy, especially about the period of Renaissance. Galileo, the giants. So it's a great honor for me to be part of your community. And today I will give a talk on a topic that I have been thinking about for a long time, because a part of my job is to teach growth, not only for the people here in China, but also for the other parts of the world. And I have been thinking, what's the best way to come up with theory, to decontextualize, then eventually you need to contextualize so that people can come up with a strategy supported by policy so that they increase their chance for them to promote growth in their own country. So let me go to 10 simple slides that I prepared for my talk, because some of the slides will deal with equations. I prefer sort of to talk off-site, but equations are difficult to just to talk off-site. So I prepare some equations here. The title today is what I would call Metaheuristic Theory of Growth. And I'm very happy to put the member Academy of Sciences, Bologna University. So I'm part of this institute. It's a great honor for me. I know it has long history. Contents, very simple, 4 parts. I'll start with a central question or the central puzzle. Then to deal with the principal building blocks of modeling the answer that I have. Basically, it's what I call metaheuristic theory. And the third part is, well, give you an illustration of the empirical results that we have, to what extent it's a valid way of looking at the world. And I will conclude with some insights and the caveats. Now, the central puzzle is important because for those of us, even in social sciences, I do not see a big difference between those of us who are involved in social sciences and those of us who are in the natural sciences. The way of thinking is very similar to me. Well, for us to do science, we start with a puzzle. Then we need to have a box of tools. And we need to give a structure to very chaotic phenomenon, seemingly chaotic phenomenon. Then based on that, we come up with a list of hypotheses, testable hypotheses, hopefully. Then we subject these hypotheses to empirical testing. Not only here in China, even though China is a big country representing 1/5 of the world's population, but everywhere in the world. But I would sort of today use China as an illustration, but certainly I'm trying to generalize beyond China, then to validate or to falsify the proposition that I have. But well, for whatever theory that I have, it won't be perfect. So I will conclude with what insights we can gain from my way of theorizing about growth, and come up with some caveats about some intellectual ways or philosophical ways of looking at the world. In other words, whatever we have won't be deterministic, it's probabilistic. And the way we look at the world, the philosophical way of looking at it will be competing with each other. But I would argue my way is a very valid way to look at the world. Now, the central puzzle, motivating puzzle. Here, I draw upon the Gaussian normal distribution because this is, to me, a very good way, the Gaussian normal distribution, to illustrate a deeper question, why some nations have developed, whereas others have stagnated. 200 years ago, China had roughly 1/3 of the world's population, and it was producing roughly a bit over 1/3 of the GDP of the world. Then over the years, we stayed there, not declining in absolute terms, but in relative terms, our share of the world's population declined. So much so that before, 40 years ago, the beginning of reforms and opening up, our share of GDP was roughly less than 3% of the total GDP of the world. Now, after 40 years of reform, we have come back to now 17% of the total GDP of the world, with a population that is roughly 1/5 of the world's population. For us to not perform normally, 1/5 of the world's population should be producing 1/5 of the total GDP of the world. So very dramatic growth story, but we are still conforming to the norm of the world. The world average GDP per capita is about 12,000. Ours is about 10,000. So we still have distance to catch up. Then, well, in a very rough way, if we look at a normal distribution, 1 standard deviation, 2 standard deviation, 3 standard deviation. On the positive side, well, the best performance is over 40,000. And in our case, we were very close to 12% in the norm. But 40 years ago, imagine here in China, our GDP per capita was roughly 150 US dollars. So this is the puzzle. Well, should it have implications for other developing countries to catch up? My argument is yes, but then we need to have a good theory to explain the very dramatic ups and downs of economic performance over the years by looking at China, but also looking at other world. So for me to come up with that theory, let me move down to the principal building blocks that I have. Well, to unpack the mystery of growth, I come up with what I would call a Metaheuristic Theory of growth. It comes with 4 sets of causes. I understand for a good theory, it should be driven by simplicity, consistency, accuracy, scope, fruitful. But then I also buy the principle of Occam's razor. When necessary, you still need to add the essential parts. In other words, it should be as simple as possible, but you should have enough so that you can explain the world in a fruitful way. You increase the scope of fruitful here means, well, in application, it will help you to design strategies so that you can push the developmental agenda. Now, the 4 causes to me is inspired by a Maxwell equation, if you may. It comes up with the physical causes first. Sort of in a vacuum, what are the principal causes of growth? So the first cause is what I would call the physical causes, it's tangible, the things that you probably can see with your naked eyes. This is sort of the Newtonian way. Then ceteris paribus, hopefully the physical causes itself will go a long way to explain the growth story. But it will also come with some unexplained parts. Now, in economic terms, you probably will come with a mystery box that we call total factor productivity. So we should not just stay there. We should go a step further to unpack the total factor productivity. And here, the second set of courses is what I would call contextual courses. Now here it's sort of, we move from the Newtonian to the Einstein. In the case of Einstein, Einstein introduced the field into the Newtonian equation, add field. And if you combine A and B, it's sort of matter tells time, space, how to curve. And the time space tells matter how to move. So the two should be connected in a way. So to explain the real world, we need to be sensitive to the contextual causes. And in the real world, for me to travel to Italy, England, France, United States, back here in China, at least you need to be sensitive to three things. One is the hierarchical institution that we call state. Every country has that, but probably they have different ways to arrange power. And there is another set of institutions that we call market. It's a horizontal, not hierarchical. State, market. Then the third dimension is what we call social. You have a lot of conventions. Conventional wisdom, Einstein said, is accumulation of prejudices, if you may, by the age of 18. We practice, it's there. But some conventions are there, probably serve as a barrier to the combination, the optimization of the physical causes. The physical causes there, you are talking about the natural capital, the human capital, the physical capital. It could be facilitating, it could be resisting. You have levels of resistance. Now, these two causes are sort of inspired by looking at moving from Newtonian way of looking at the world to the Einstein way of looking at the world, and to map the degree of causes. Probability tensor is the concept we should use to map the level of resistance. But what's different between natural causes, the natural science and the social sciences, is that we are human beings. Somehow we are motivated by the deep level of utilities, if you may, or the value we have. And there we can think of Maslow. Now, the social science is Maslow. It's a pyramid of the 5 layers of pyramids. The physical one going up all the way to the intellectual one, self-actualization. Economists tend not to open up the more motivational causes. But for us to look at the whole picture, it's good for us to be sensitive of that. Of course, we are talking not just the utility, singular forms, utilities. And if you have a singular forms, it probably makes sense for us to think of the ordering of these utilities so that we are closer to reality. We are human beings. And ultimately, go a layer down. We are also interested in the ideas, human ideas. If you say growth differences, variance, ultimately probably is driven by the idea gap we have. And that make a huge difference between us as human beings and the other crowd of animals. It is the ideas that make a difference. First, between us and other animals, and within our own group, probably idea also make a difference in terms of economic performance. So, a short summary. I'm trying to combine 4 sets of causes in a holistic way. I know holistic has problems. It's not deep analytically, but deeply analytical also has problems. So I'm trying to strike a balance between being analytical and holistic. And hopefully this is a good way for me to come up with a theory. Now, to express the theory in mathematical expression, you look at the first equation here. I said GDP per capita in the place, in the period of time, in the time TW is a function. Now, I do not use equation, I use approximations, because in the real world, there is no such a thing as we can write equation. It's always approximations. If you look at quantum mechanics, it's driven by probability, not certainty. And the growth is here, it says growth is a function of natural capital. Okay, K stands for capital. Well, another way of saying it's the land, but I would sort of use the same letter K, called the natural capital. And today we can think of natural capital as both terrestrial and also celestial because of climate change things. It's not infinite, it's finite. We should be sensitive to that. And the human capital, the second one stands for human capital, then the physical capital. So the first equation says, all else being equal, growth is a function of natural capital, human capital, and physical capital. And that probably can go a considerable way for us to explain growth variations, but not all. As I said, this equation does not have micro equations, foundations. This equation does not have the contextual differences. So add to this equation, I add a second equation, the institutional context. As I said, all else being equal, growth measured by GDP per capita is a function of institutional capital vertical. Well, it's another way of saying it's the quality of the state. It's what's the best way for you to arrange power. Power has to be there, but it should not be arbitrary so that it frightens away capital. It should be a helping hand rather than a grabbing hand, to put that simple. Then the second is institutional capital horizontal. Institutional capital horizontal, here what I'm saying is market. Market is a horizontal institution. It cannot work by itself, and it has to work in coordination, if that's the correct word to use, with institutional capital vertical. In other words, in any society, you need to have a state, it's hierarchical. You need also to have a horizontal institution that we call market. And between the two, we should also look at institutional capital social. In other words, to say the extreme, tribal, for instance, or tribal, even in the absence of state and in the absence of market, if we are a very close knit group of friends, we can continue to transact. But the drawback of that is we cannot engage in long distance transactions. The state has to be there. The market has to be so sophisticated. In other words, these first two variables should go hand in hand. In other words, market cannot work without the rule of law. So markets and the rule of law, then social capital to smooth out some of the rough edges. But social capital itself has its limits. So these two equations. In other words, by adding the second equation, I add what physicists would call field into the Newtonian equation. But as I indicated first, since we're dealing with the human beings, we need to be incentivized or motivated. So the third equation is growth, all else be equal, is a function of private returns getting closer to social returns. In other words, when private return is getting so close to social returns is defined as private returns plus an X. X could be in the form of taxation or otherwise, because the state has to be there. But can you sort of do not sort of waste your taxpayers' money to do extravagant state such that people are motivated to work harder. So the third equation, all else be equal, we also need to have a good incentive. And the third equation is always embedded in the second equation, okay? Incentive tend to be embedded in institutions. So it's all interrelated. And the last equation, growth, all else being equal, is human capital and the physical capital or the machine getting closer, closer, closer. In other words, the extreme form is my brain is the machine extension. The machine is my brain, okay? Now, the literary word to use to express that equation is when we human beings move from Homo sapien to Homo deus. And we have initial evidence coming on the horizon with the AI and the kind of stuff, even though it can only mimic so far the left part of the brain, not the right part of the brain. In other words, for formal logic, the AI is there, probably so powerful that it can replace many of the human beings, but we human beings still have the artistic part to reset the whole set of knowledge. Mathematics is in the game a set of rules. It still has two sets of holes at the axiomatic level, and also it's not a knowledge that comes completely with the theorems. It also comes with the conjectures. And to fill up those holes, it is it's the job for our human beings. Now, with the four equations here, we can come up with them theorems. The first theorem is the state has to be there. It's larger than zero, okay? The vertical institution has to be there. Theorem, almost. In other words, there is no such country in the world. It only has a market without a state. No such thing. If you're talking about the protection of private property, the state has to be there, for instance. And the second theorem, institutional capital horizontal is larger than the one. Market itself will incur transaction cost. Okay. And the third one, the society has to be there. So larger than zero, larger than zero, larger than zero. And the last equation is social returns equals to private returns plus an X tax, what have you. So these are embedded into the four equations that I sketched out here. Now, this is sort of analytical. For us to see, to open up a black box, these are the critical elements, building blocks there. Now, the next challenge is, do we have a way to connect the four equations in a holistic way? This is the equation that I wrote to connect and also to integrate the macro level, the mid-level, and the micro level analysis. This first part is growth measured by GDP per capita. It's a function of the physical cost. This part is the physical cost. Okay. Natural capital, human capital, physical capital, divided by the contextual causes. Institutional capital, vertical, state. Institutional capital, horizontal, the market. Institutional capital, social. Now, the way to measure is the best score is 0, but you cannot have 0. It's defined here. It's anywhere between 0 and 1. 1 is 0. Now, if it's 0, 0 minus 0 equals 0. If you have stuff here divided by 0, then you have infinite wealth. You are God. But for us human beings, the divine world is on the other side of the river. We can never be there. Forget about it. We can try to be closer. Okay. Then further divided, it's like a deep learning. several layers divided by the incentive equation. How else? But you can never come up with such an incentive structure that it comes, you score a 1. So 1 minus 1 equals 0. Anything here divided by 0, it's infinite. It's the God's world, it's infinite. Okay, we are human beings, we can never be there. And the last one is the idea gap. Okay, if you say our idea is 1, then 1 minus 1, it's the God, it's infinite. So each part is related to the other parts. For instance, to give you an illustration, in the case of China, to start reforms, we are rich in natural resource here. We are rich in human resources, sort of middle schooling, but we were poor in capital. Okay, so we want to have more capital. So it makes sense not only to reform internally, but also to open up so that we can attract foreign capital. But to attract foreign capital, it's connected with the state. Okay, we need to reduce the arbitrary way of the state, okay, to open up. And we need to build more market here. And we also need to open up the society. In other words, we need to allow migration. Once you allow migration to go from countryside to cities, you see there are deep transformation of a society. One way to see that is our family tend to be extended family 40 years ago. Now it's nuclear, less than nuclear family, moving around. What I want to say, it's all interconnected. In other words, it's not just the physical cause, but the physical cause has to be embedded in institutional settings here. You're talking about state, you're talking about market, you're talking about society. And you're also talking about better incentives and a better education here. So in summary, I'm saying this equation connects and integrates macro, this sort of macro thing. It's the visible stuff you can see, natural capital, okay? Human capital, physical capital. With the mid-level, institution level, it's really invisible, but it's there. Then the micro level analysis, the incentive, institution embedded, the way you look at the world. How do you process information? It's sort of here, it's sort of neuroscience. The thing that you can think of is neuroscience. What is the best way to process information, to open up the human brain in a way? I like mathematics. Mathematics is driven by simplicity. I also like to theorize. Theorize to me is to decontextualize. But then to design policies, to design strategy, you have a good theory and you need to contextualize. 1 + 1 = 2 is awfully theoretical. There is nothing that we have seen in the real world. 1 + 1 = 2. Very theoretical, very simple. But to use that, we say 1 apple, another apple, 2 apples. This is only an approximation to first equation. So going back to reduce the 4 equation back into 1, ultimately, growth to me is a function here of natural capital than the idea gap, okay? I sort of take out, like Galileo, assume away air first, then I say assume away institutions, assume away incentives, because both institutions and incentives are the result of better ideas. Given time, we are smart enough to design better institutions, to come up with better incentives, to empower, to incentivize better ideas. So in a way, this equation says growth, after all, is a function of natural capital and idea gaps. It's from Homo sapien to Homo deus. Wow. And truth is driven by simplicity to me. And then, of course, we should not ignore reality. Any society is reality. We are human societies, and the reality is ugly and needs to be reformed. In other words, to reduce the level of frictions when we need to combine things like natural capital, human capital, and the physical capital. Now, this is the model that I present to you. It's what I call, this is now here, it's also axiomatic causes at the deepest level. Okay. You're seeing a beautiful building. We're looking at the ground floor. Then you build the second floor, the third floor. Empirical evidence. I'm not going to give you a long list of tests, but I would just show you the very exciting empirical evidence. It's a multiprogression. I choose the three stuff. I choose the very counterintuitive human institution that we call rule of law. Okay, we have kings and emperors first. Why should they come up with an institution that would go against themselves? But some societies manage to build rule of law. Sort of, well, they build a state, but with a very sophisticated arrangement that we call rule of law. In other words, institutional capital is very thick in those countries. Okay, you have that. It's sort of in a proxy for institutional arrangement of vertical state. And I also choose the entry level of market. Market should have free entry levels. So that stands for market. And I also use the number of fields price, sort of mathematics. Not just the physical, the modern physics, but also metaphysics, logic, fields price. It represents probably the very cutting edge of the human brain, leading to me beyond physics. So Fields Prize, Nobel Prize, modern science, then Turing Prize, it's technology. So I combine three and normalize by the population distribution of the world, and you add three together and you run a regression, an R square over 80%. That is awfully impressive. You know? The 20%, then it's for the rest of the story. You can explore further into that, what I call Metaheuristic Theory of growth. Let me conclude with some insights and the caveats of this exercise, what I call Metaheuristic Theory of growth. First, theory cum praxia. To me, theory and strategy are two different things. We often say Greeks are good at theory, the Romans are good at strategy. And thanks go to Angelo, we talk about that. Remember? And the Chinese are good at strategy as well. One way to understand that is a theory is sort of, to say the extreme, is to decontextualize. And the strategy is to contextualize. This is sort of the insight we can get from that equation. And the second, I need to explain a little bit about the metaheuristic. What does that mean? Meta means if you have four equations, there is an overarching frame to hold the four equations together. It's called meta. Heuristic is not deterministic, it's probabilistic. It is not awfully deductive, oftentimes inductive. But for countries to move forward, especially for those countries who are in the business of catching up, inductive learning is very important. But when you are on the very frontier of knowledge, probably the balance should go in favor of the deductive as well. Okay, very analytical, push the very frontier. Induction can be mimicking others. In the language of Immanuel Kant, inductive is the synthetic part. Deductive part is the a priori part. And we can also get that from the equation that we have written, both singularly and holistically. And to understand the growth from that equation, we are looking at 4 stages of human society. One is status. For the bulk of a human society, before industrialization, GDP per capita were more or less the same. Okay, in the way we repeat history, status. Then the extreme part is chaos. War broke out, no growth. But for the equation we have written to explain growth, we are primarily looking at the 2 parts, order and the complexity. Okay. And as the 4th equation indicates, we are not just looking at order. The first equation is very orderly. Growth is a function of land, labor, capital. It's good. But what it's lacking is the complexity. So we add 3 layers to the equation. It has complexity, but it's because of the complexity, it is a source of growth. It's through different combinations of the principal building blocks, then you push the frontier of technology, not just the hardware, but also the institutional technology, software. It also gives room for entrepreneurship. And moving further down, so sort of looking at the equation sort of philosophically, the way we sort of organize knowledge. The way I look at knowledge tend to be disparate. Some crowds tend to be lovers of behaviorism. But to me, behaviorism with a structuralism has no explanatory power. You are just looking at chaotic phenomena from a chaotic phenomena. Even though when you run regressions, well, you have parallels, but not underlying causes. So behind behaviorism, we also need to look for structuralism. Einstein's equation E equals mc squared is awfully structural, okay? And with that simple equation, you can explain all the physical phenomena. So the structure has to be there. It has to be simpler than phenomena so that the theory has explanatory power. Now, the challenge for us doing social sciences is that when you look at the structure, is the structure evolving? Oh, it's just there. I tend to argue that for us social sciences, even when we look at the structure, the state, the market, the society, over time, longer terms, the structure continues to evolve. So we need to add evolutionism. So the efforts here is to try to combine behaviorism with the structuralism so that the theory is deeper. You're looking at underlying causes. And in a way, we drive very deeper because we are also looking at the idea gap, the human brains. But in short, it's a combination of both. It's a combination of behaviorism, structuralism, evolution. Now, probably for us to remember that we need to add, sort of to make the difference contribution, we need a new behaviorism, structuralism, evolutionism. Now, the implication for neoclassic economics is that, to me, the neoliberal model at the very fundamental level is driven by mathematics. But then when you look at the reality, a tiny percentage of population love mathematics. Okay? But when you use that model to impose it on the world, it will generate tensions. Okay? In other words, it's too homogeneous. Longer term, you can homogenize because the philosophers all emphasize the important role of education. But what is the pace of learning? And we need to be sensitive to that. So a remedy for that, now here I'm sort of sensitive to the kind of a strategy we use. We need to think of anthropology as well, to balance the two, so that as we move forward in a way that brings everyone together with the view. And that brings me to the last point that I want to make. It's about human rationality. Human rationality is not a given thing. It's an evolutionary process. And to finish up my presentation, I would quote Habermas' very famous line: modernization is an unfinished agenda. We should continue to move in that direction. For empirical support, and I said, okay, grazie to all my colleagues, and also grazie to the data that I have looked at. Economic freedom, fields, Nobel Prize, tooling, freedom in the world, and what have you. I put it here. Thank you very much for your attention. Angelo, back to you.
Thank you so much, Fujun. Thank you for this wonderful, wonderful lecture, which is important on two levels. The first level is the theoretical level, very, very deep, and very holistic, as you say. And this gives us also a very good insight about one way of Chinese thinking about the economy, institutions, and the market and society that is very peculiar and absolutely important. I thank you for having quoted Jürgen Habermas at the end of your lecture, as Jürgen Habermas was made a member of our academy the same day as you were made a member of our academy.
Okay.
So, yeah, the very same session where you were elected, Jürgen Habermas was elected. And I think this is a good sign that we did good choices. Thank you so much, really. And now, pleasure to give the floor to Roberto.
Yes, Roberto. Thank you. Thank you, Angelo. I will try to share my screen now. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent, excellent. So, well, first of all, I am myself, I would like to join Angelo in expressing my very deep appreciation for Fujun's lecture, actually. I think it was a wonderful beginning to the wonderful exploration along the trajectory that Angelo was outlining for us, back to fundamentals. And well, in this going back to fundamentals, I was deeply impressed by the fundamental equation, G equal to K sub N times delta sub I, which of course resonates with us economists in the sense that it brings us back to an important fundamental distinction in economic theory between wealth as a fund, K over sub N, and wealth as a flow, which is of course implied by the role of this delta sub I. This, again, has then brought Fujun's to the notion of complexity, and I will actually explore, I would say, some of the implications of the concept of complexity, but taking as a vantage point not the natural sciences, but the heritage, which is a very important heritage of economic theory. And this is actually the content of my presentation. I will try actually to be brief, but the PowerPoint is available to all, actually, if anybody is interested. Well, first of all, I will very briefly give an outline of how political economy was born. Political economy was not an obvious subject. It was born partly in its current format as a result of the scientific revolution of the 16th to 17th century. And as a result of that, this is point two, economic theory was developed, but in a complex way, actually adopting different ways of simplifying complexity, fundamentally following a dual track. But going back to the notion of complexity, what is central in the idea of complexity, this is point three, is that not all complexities are the same, as it's well known since I would say at least a very well-known paper by Weaver, one has to distinguish between disorganized and organized complexity. And once we accept the idea that an economic system or even a socio-economic system at large is actually a very important instance of organized complexity, there is a principle which we should never forget about, which is the principle of relative structural invariance. And I will devote some minutes on actually developing this principle, which I think is implicit in much work on complexity, but it's not always foregrounded. But this principle is a principle which gives scope, and this is my point five, both for the search for generalizations, which is, of course, at the core of any scientific enterprise, and on the other hand, assigning a deep influence and being serious about the consideration of context. In terms of current developments in economic theory, this is of course point six, because there is actually a kind of complementarity which we should be aware of, I think, between approaches emphasizing evolutionary change, and we have, I mean, an enormous literature on evolutionary economics in recent economic literature, and approaches emphasizing structure, the resilience of structures, the fact that structures themselves can have an inner driving force, which is actually typical of another very important tradition in economic theorizing, which is the structural dynamics tradition. By the way, a tradition to which economic scholars have devoted very important attention. And I will conclude by trying actually to provide in very synthetically an overview of what may be called embedded policy making, namely a policy making which is not taken out of the blue, but which is actually derived and drawn from a deep understanding of the role of structures and of the working of structures within context. So this is very briefly actually what I will try to say. And my feeling after listening to John's lecture is that stemming from different approaches, methodologies, basically also from different strands of literature, we are actually heading towards the same set, the same cluster of issues. Now, from oikonomia to political economy, as everybody knows, I mean, the concept of economia was already in Aristotle, but so we are talking about the 4th century BC. But in Aristotle, oikonomia was basically a kind of subject having to do with the proper arrangement of resources and of activities within the private housing. What is interesting is that if we move to the last quarter of the 4th century, there is a work called Oikonomikos, which develops Aristotle's ideas into a larger framework, basically distinguishing between different types of oikonomias, where basically there is the oikonomia of the king, of the provincial governor, and of the city-state. And this oikonomia of the city-state is explicitly called oikonomia politicae, which means political economy. Now, what has happened then to political economy? Political economy, therefore, was already discovered at the end of the 4th century BC, at least in the West. Well, basically it was rediscovered, if I may say so. When various states in early modern Europe between the 16th and the early 17th century started to think about how to getting organized, how to organize themselves, not simply in terms of arranging the household of the king, but considering the nation as a unit of analysis. And this is what I call here the return to political economy. Well, Giovanni Botero was a very important author from Piedmont in Italy, actually, in contributing to this. I would say that I would still maintain that the Neapolitan economist Antonio Serri is probably the most important forerunner because he was explicitly adopting a scientific point of view, and the term itself, political economy, probably in a modern European language, economie politique, was probably used for the first time a few years after Serra by Montlesquieu. But I mean, in terms of actual developments, I think we have to make a jump. The jump is to late 17th century Britain, when particularly with the work of William Petty, you have the idea of political economy as a careful empirical investigation of the various items of national wealth, what he called political arithmetic. But on the basis of political arithmetic, you have around the mid 18th century, two very important scholars, one from Italy, actually from Naples, Genovesi, the other from Scotland, Stewart, who were actually probably they were among the first actually to take advantage of political arithmetic in order to investigate not only political arithmetic, but also what Genovesi himself explicitly was calling political geometry, namely understanding what the proper proportions between the different economic activities, the different items of national wealth should be arranged vis-a-vis one another in order to produce economic development and growth. And I mean, I should actually emphasize that Genovesi's book was widely translated in other European languages. It was translated for the first time in German. Then it was translated in a very successful translation into Spanish. It was widely read in Spanish America, and it was basically considered as a kind of prototype for development strategy of the then nascent, newly independent Republic of South America. The Scottish scholar, James Stewart, was also very interesting from this point of view because he was actually emphasizing the role of context in developing, in formulating a development strategy. And of course, we all know about Friedrich List, who was actually working in the early decades of the 19th century. He was opposing actually the English, basically English classical economists in advancing the idea that individual countries should have their own individual path towards growth and development. So this is, you know, a kind of anti-fact. What happens as a result of all this, that around the mid 18th century, economic theory started to be formulated. So in a way, we may even say that the early developments of economic theory have been a late result of the 17th century scientific revolution in natural science. This early development of economic theory, of course, was based on simplification of complexity. What is remarkable, this is something which was already noticed actually by two very distinguished economists, John Hicks, the Nobel Prize winning economist, and Luigi Pasinetti. Namely, there was a route which emphasized the markets and exchange, and another route which emphasized the interdependencies between activities at the level of the economic system as a whole. What John Hicks calls catalactics. Catalactics means exchange versus political economy, which entails a kind of holistic approach. So two main lines. And the two main lines, this is something I would like to emphasize, actually, because it's very important in view of today's discussion, have continued to this present day, one line is the line following John Hicks's terminology of catalactics, which actually exploits the heritage of ancient Aristotle-type oikonomia, which was actually basically a set of decision-making rules in order to arrange for a proper and rational arrangement of resources within the house. Except that now the household is substituted by the national. This basically is at the root of economic theory, of neoclassical economic theory. Economic theory as a theory of rational decisions under constraints, which of course provided the identity of late 19th century marginalism and of 20th century general equilibrium theory, contributed by a lot of distinguished economists such as Arrow, Debreu, Coupens, Frank Kahn. But there is the other actually strand, which is the heritage of the more holistic approach to political economy, which develops not the tradition of private oikonomia, but rather the tradition of political arithmetic. This is, of course, intellectual tradition which we have distinguished contributions by classical political economists. But it is a tradition which has continued in the 20th century in the multisectoral theory of the economic system, to which contributed economists such as Leontiev, von Neumann, and also three economists like Piero Sraffa, Luigi Pasinetti, and Quadrio Curzio, who is attending this lecture and contributing to this lecture today. Now, I said that complexity actually sits behind all of this. And I will devote a few minutes actually to develop this point, because I think that the theory of complexity is also a very important common ground between what I'm saying now and what Jones has said in his lecture. Now, economic systems clearly are complex systems, and here I will use Herbert Simon's definition of complexity as and of complex system as a system of interdependent parts, such that the result of the interdependence of the interaction between those parts, it's not a trivial matter, so that you cannot actually in a simple way and in a reductionist way derive the property of the whole simply from knowing the properties of the individual parts. This is Herbert Simon's definition of complexity, and I'm referring in particular to his classical paper, Architecture of Complexity. Now, in that paper, Herbert Simon explicitly refers to Weaver's distinction between disorganized versus organized complexity. What is organized complexity? Organized complexity is basically the complexity in which not everything depends equally on everything else, but it is a system in which there is what Simon describes as architecture. Now, architecture means that the system is a kind of building. Many things can happen within that building, but not everything depends on everything else, and not all connections between components of that system have equal strength. That introduces a concept which I think is implicit in the idea of organized complexity, but which, I mean, was labeled perhaps for the first time in a paper by Michael Landesheim and myself published in 1990, which is the principle of relative structural invariance. I mean, the idea is not new. The terminology is probably was used for the first time by us. Now, the concept of relative structural invariance is, I think, a concept which is of great help in making sense of economic theory and of how we can use economic theory in order to find a balance between generalization and context. Now, in this slide, I'm trying to outline what we may call the core principles of relative structural invariance. Now, principle one is that the component subsystems of an overall complex economic system are, we can accept that they are subject to change, but, and this is why I italicize this sentence, not all subsystems change in the same way and or at the same speed. This means, point two, that we can identify a precise hierarchy of motions such that certain subsystems can change only after other subsystems have also changed. So there is a kind of embedded sequencing of change between different components of the system we are visualizing once we allow for relative structural invariance to play a role. Final third point here is that if we take relative structural invariances seriously, which means if we are serious about addressing economic systems as a case of organized complexity, then we must acknowledge that there is a deep structure of any given economic system, where this deep structure is basically associated with our ability, with the existence and therefore with our ability of identifying a particular set of invariant relationships between the different components. Now, all this clearly has an immediate impact on how to combine generalizations with attention for contexts. Why is that so? This is so because such invariant relationships are normally compatible not with a single, but with a variety of institutional arrangements and policies. Now, how can we decide, I mean, basically, between the various elements of this variety, where all elements of variety can be in principle consistent with the fundamental invariant relationship defined in deep structure? Well, one point is, of course, time horizons, in the sense that the time horizons of individual or collective actors, time horizons of policymakers, for instance, may shape in a fundamental way the way in which relative invariances are opening up or closing off policy options. Depending on how long your time horizon is, basically certain relative invariances have to be taken as given, as constraints, or they can be removed as constraints. Then, final point here. Clearly, we must acknowledge that there is a mutual influence between relative invariances identifying what I've called the deep structure of the system and the time horizon of policy actions. This mutual influence between the time horizon of policy actions and the actual role of the relative invariances are, I think, at the core of the specific historical dynamic trajectories followed by different economic systems in the course. Now, let me now try to make a reference to two rather complementary strands of economic literature, which have been which are quite well known, and which I think we can take into consideration when basically interpreting this general framework in terms of how to make sense of current working economic theory. Well, of course, evolutionary economics, as Fujun has already remarked, is one of the most important strands of current evolutionary economics, and mainly of of the type of current work in economic theory, which has tried to take seriously economic history and the contextualization of policies. Well, of course, here I am referring to the work of an economist who is not generally taken as an evolutionary economist, but who would contribute a lot to our understanding of evolutionary paths. I'm referring to John Hicks and to his wonderful book, A Theory of Economic History, a book which, by the way, was very influential upon Douglas North's work on the theory of economic history. And I remember that because I remember attending a conference and talking to Douglas North, and Douglas North was telling me that he was basically trying to write a book, which was his 2005 book, on the basis and on the influence of John Hicks' theory of economics. And then, of course, Paul David and his work on path dependence. But of course, evolutionary change is important in terms of analyzing context and how one context can basically breed another context, and on how different contexts can actually outline a complete trajectory, which is the concept of path dependence. But there is a drawback in evolutionary economics. The drawback is that they often tend to disregard what I call fundamental structure, and they often tend to disregard the fundamental role of what I've called relative structural invariance. And of course, if we take relative structural invariance seriously, then we must take seriously the work of classical political economists, Smith, Ricardo, Marx, and also the work of contemporary structural economists, of whom a very important representative is with us today, Professor Quadrio Curzio, and Luigi Pasinetti as well. Finally, I think that if we have to foresee an important and rather fundamental, I would say, frontier of research for current economic theory, following the kind of template that Professor Fujun has just outlined, this, in my view, would be attempting and exploring the mutual fertilization between the theory of evolutionary change, evolutionary economics, and the theory of structural dynamics. Now, I am actually approaching the concluding part of my short, I hope it has been short enough, talk. What has all this to do with policy, with policy making? Well, it seems to me that there are clear implications of this framework, which I have outlined, for policy making. And it seems to me that the implications are quite consistent and complementary to what Professor Fujun has told us in the first presentation of today's workshop. Basically, is the idea of embedded policy making. This idea is basically the idea that policies cannot be devised out of the blue, that effective policies have to have a kind of framework and a kind of very important rootedness in deep understanding of the internal structure of the economic system, of the role of relative structure and invariances, and therefore of the role that context can play in an intelligent way in order to devise policies which are both context relevant and also capable of projecting the system along interesting development trajectories. This is actually the meaning of embedded policy making. And if anybody is interested, may I just refer to a book which it has just been finished, actually, which I produced with a colleague from Canterbury University, which is called The Constitution of Political Economy, where embedded policy making plays a central role. It will be published at the end of this year by Cambridge University Press. Now, from the point of view of social theory, clearly, this is not a new problem. Sociologists know for decades, or maybe more than decades, about the action versus structure problem. this is actually an attempt to bring policy making basically in close relationship with the action versus structure. Something that is directly relevant to the idea of embedded policy making is the fact that, of course, when looking at the economic system as an instance of organized complexity, we must first of all adopt an appropriate and effective visualization of the interdependencies within the economic system we are dealing with policy strategies. And the issue of how to visualize interdependencies is not at all an obvious issue. Actually, here the problem is the problem of how to aggregate and of how to disaggregate between the various components of the system. There are alternative possible representations of the interdependence, which means that basically organized complexity, which relies so much on an appropriate and effective aggregation and or decomposition criteria, as inherently a kind of open-endedness, which of course fits very well with Fujun's appeal for a probabilistic approach. Let me give just an example of this possibility of alternative visualization of interdependencies, which basically has been developed in work in structural theory. And this is simply the distinction between horizontal versus vertical representations of production networks. Clearly, an horizontal production network is a production network in which basically all activities depend on any other activities as possible, whereas a vertical representation is a representation of a production network in which you emphasize supply chains, which actually in which basically the vertical links the idea that A must be done before B, so that B can take place and allow C to be carried out, and so on and so forth. So this is a kind of linear view, whereas the former, the horizontal view, brings into the front line the kind of more circular kind of interdependence between the different activities carried out within the economic system. So basically, in view of this possibility of alternative visualizations of what I called the fundamental structure of the economy, clearly policy making has many degrees of freedom, but what is important to realize is that to assign degrees of freedom to policy making is something completely different from arbitrariness of policy making. And actually effective policy making is precisely attached and dependent on the policymaker's ability to visualize what is the correct context-dependent visualization of interdependencies, which makes it possible to have an effective template for what may be called embedded policy making. So I believe all this provides an overview of which is, I would say, in a way, certainly complementary to what Professor Fujun has told us today. Thank you for your attention. Angelo, Angelo.
Yeah, sorry, I'm here now. I say thank you, Roberto, for this very interesting presentation, which is putting together history and theory, which is, of course, perfectly complementary to what Fujun said. And I like very much your interactions, and then that makes you a very good candidate as a visiting professor to Beijing in our program. By the way.
Welcome.
You are a perfect candidate for the. I think you could interact with Fujun in a wonderful way. Hope this will be possible. It's not up to me to decide. It's the Harry, but I'm quite confident. And now we have the pleasure to have Professor Quadrio Curzio doesn't need any presentation, as it, in addition to that, which was given by Professor Tega, Emeritus President of the National Academy of Lincei. And for those who don't know, he was the teacher of Professor Scazzieri when Scazzieri was a student. So Alberto, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Angelo. When Professor Petroni showed to me the program of this meeting, I was really impressed by the CV of Fujun that already met in meeting of Aspen Institute, and looking much better to his contribution, I became an admirer of him. Of course, I knew very well Roberto Scazzieri, and so I proposed to Angelo Petroni to say some word at the end of this meeting. Obviously, I have anything to add to the presentation of these two outstanding scholars, as any tentative to add something might or certainly will reduce the importance of their contributions. Just two general comments. In my opinion, the two contributions were perfectly complementary, because Fujun's contribution was much more based on mathematical reconstruction of the theories in a certain way of change and growth. He talked about very different kind of capital, explaining to us the complementarity of these different kind of capital. Roberto Scazzieri had a more historical approach, but in a certain way, this approach is crucial also for more analytical approach and vice versa. So I think that we had a morning with the two complementary contributions, which helped us to understand better the complexity of the interpretation of any kind of dynamics in the world in which we live. Having said that, I would like to ask just some words about what I've tried to do in these fields. And I am aware that terminology and heuristic utilization of terminology is not so easy, especially for me, being an economist of traditional type. But I feel that Angelo Petroni, who is a quite outstanding personality in the field of logics and the utilization of logics in any kind of science, might help me to be, might correct my words and eventually my concept. Going back to some name of famous economists, putting this definition in a very wide sense, I would like to mention 3 or 4 kind of economists, especially one is certainly an economist, the other 2 much less, but might be considered a kind of economist, on which I based my contribution, let us say, of economics and economic theory, maybe. One, of course, is Leontiev, who is connected also in a certain way with Sraffa contribution. Both had a multi-sectoral approach, which, in my opinion, cannot be considered of dynamic type, even if Leontiev is much more dynamic than Zlaffa. Secondly, von Neumann, who elaborated a first important model, multi-sectoral model of economic growth. And finally, and this might seem rather funny, Pontryagin with the theory of controls. Because why I mentioned these outstanding scientists? Because in a certain way, I started from their work to elaborate some of my contribution. Contribution is certainly too ambitious, but my reflection on the fields of structural economic dynamics and dynamics of structural changes, both. Going back to some kind of classification, I think that we might consider that resources are certainly a quite difficult terminology to utilize. I consider resources as the institution, society, and economy. In my opinion, these are structural resources. Then I consider functional resources, knowledge, education, and science. All these functional resources are generating very, very remarkable changes in the economic dynamics, or more generally in the dynamics of society, institution, and economy. And finally, I think that there are behavioral resources, coordination, competition, and cooperation. Having said that, I think that one fundamental point in all these general presentations is the problem of discontinuity. And discontinuity has the characteristic everywhere it happens to change the complementarity or the antagonism among all these structural resources, functional resources, and behavioral resources. In these days, for instance, we are living in an enormous discontinuity caused by the revolution of the so-called internet revolution. And this discontinuity is presenting to us a radical change also in the role of institution. Just to give you an example, Amazon has a value in the stock exchange which is bigger than the value of the whole European stock exchange. So one single global firm has a stock exchange capitalization which is bigger of the whole stock exchange of the European Union. My question is, the discontinuity of the radical innovation of internet has generated giants which are much more powerful than institution, society, and economy. So what is the problem? Who does control on this kind of giant? Which is the institution capable to have a kind of influence on this giant of the so-called international revolution? This has, in my opinion, one very simple solution. The cooperation on the worldwide dimension of institution is absolutely fundamental to put these giant under a certain kind of control, otherwise the democracies themselves might be at risk. The conclusion is odd and very simple. Any kind of mathematical reconstruction, any kind of historical reconstruction has to keep into account revolutions which might be capable to change the relationship between institutions, society, economy, and coordination, competition, and cooperation. It's not a contribution to the speeches of Fujun and Roberto Scazzieri, but in my opinion, it would be useful to think about this risk in which we are living in this period of our history. Thank you to Angelo for having accepted my, in a certain way, strange interpretation of what is happening. But being Angelo Petroni, a good friend of mine, I'm sure that it will be generous toward me. Many thanks.
Many thanks, Alberto. I could not be not generous in any way, but I don't need to be generous in front of an economist like you, as a youth mind like yours. So glad of this discussion. Now we have time for discussion. And I have one of the participants, Professor Pamolli, was professor of economics at the Polytechnic Institute in Milan, was already raising his hand. And then, so I give him the floor, and then other people who want to intervene, please manifest yourself. It's very small conversation. Fabio, do you want to intervene?
Thank you, Angelo, and thank you to the speakers for a very interesting seminar and an incredible number of stimuli that I will somehow try to just to raise a few considerations from perhaps a peripheral kind of angle. I think that on the one side, there is a kind of a significant complexity which can be addressed within each of the different methodological approaches that were raised, and the different modeling strategies. And I want to focus on a specific point, which is related to dynamics at different levels of aggregation within socioeconomic systems. And coming back to a principle that was stated explicitly by Herbert Simon, and that we quote in a recent book that we published with Cambridge University Press together with Gene Stanley and Sergei Buldyrev, so two physicists, and which is on growth at different levels of aggregation. I quote Giri and Simon: if the very same regularity appears among diverse phenomena having no obvious common mechanism, then chance operating through the laws of probability becomes a plausible candidate for explaining that regularity, which is obviously a precondition, but brings me to a series of considerations. First, the understanding of the stochastic structure, the stochastic environment in which interactions happen to occur is interesting per se. So, for example, what we learned in the last 15 years about processes of growth is that the generative processes that we do observe across different domains and different levels of aggregation imply a systematic violation of some of the assumptions that are embedded into some of the economic models that have been used and some of the econometric techniques that have been developed. So this is a very interesting element. So, for example, we know that the probability density function of growth distributions starting from the very micro level of products up to the macro level of GDP of countries is far from being Gaussian, but it tends to be double exponential, so Laplace in the body with power law tails, which then we can characterize in terms of the exponent of the power law. But that means that even starting at the very micro level, we do have a violation of the law of proportional growth, which is kind of Gibrat or geometric Brownian motion, as which is quite interesting, because it brings some new evidence in the way in which aggregation does not wash away extreme events that happen to be, so that there is a granularity element in processes of growth that is somehow interesting. It's just an example. It's just an example of the fact that a better understanding of the stochastic environment across different institutional settings, across these different domains, is still an area which is interesting per se, and which then somehow can help us positioning the different stories that we can tell on the role of institutions. So it comes also with a methodological implication, because once we have a few benchmarks at the level of the stochastic processes, the stochastic environment, then I will stop in a minute, then we can somehow play with some conditions, so that we move from unconditional objects, so from kind of universal ambitions, to conditioning on generative processes, also based on what we know about the institutional settings and their consequences on the dynamics that we observe. Second element that I want to characterize is the fact that even when we, and then there was a very interesting reference by Roberto Scazzieri about networks, vertical and horizontal, and this is a very important point, because from the point of view of the modeling strategies, this literature has tried, not in a way which has been fully articulated, but has tried to rely on operators that are not differential. So and has tried to introduce kind of a general application, coming back to Simon again, of topological methods that are global in nature, that try to detect the properties of economic systems and economic interactions at different points in time, to detect the discontinuities into the dynamic laws that were not postulated ex ante. So by the fact that we do not rely on differential operators, we also implicitly say that we infer properties of the dynamic laws from explorative exercises that are done through agnostic methods that are topological in nature. And this is a very interesting point, because coming back to the near decomposability assumption and to the complexity and the architecture of complexity, it allows to focus on an element that Herbert Simon did not explicitly consider, which is the transition between one architecture of complexity to another, which is what happens during the transition when you have a violation of the near decomposability for a transition between the two equilibria. And this is very interesting, because you can disentangle two different reasons for indecomposability. One could be randomness, that is to say, you have a random graph evolving over times, and the other one is multiple ordering criteria coexisting for short periods of time during the dynamic evolution of a network, so that you cannot postulate the dynamic law ex ante, but you discover the entry of multiple competing ordering criteria on a graph, and then you come back to the dynamic representation. So as I said, those are very kind of marginal footnotes to what you have been mentioning, but thank you for your great presentations, and that's it.
Thank you, Fabio. Now, Professor Renzo Orsi, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to put just two two questions about the presentation. I was mainly concerned with model and empirical analysis, as the title of the conference states, but in fact, for what concerns empirical analysis, there is very few material on that. And I mentioned to the Professor Fuju model that he presents a set of structural equations based on the new theory. At least it is new for me because I never heard it before. And well, in a sense, he solves the model by presenting a very simple equation form with the empirical results that are based on a linear form. Well, I don't understand on what assumption this kind of linear equation has been obtained and how to interpret correctly the empirical result concerned with this linear specification. So, because, okay, I think that the correct tool for performing a useful empirical analysis is to perform this analysis based on structural model. But structural models are complex to handle because they are nonlinear. There is a lot of problem that should be simplified, and solving a structural model, the solution is based on a set of assumptions that should be explained and considered. Okay, the second question is about if you want a mainstream that we have in evaluation of political economy empirically. This is based on the treatment effect models. There is a large part of literature in applied econometrics now that provides useful results for evaluation of program of policy measures based on randomized experiment or quasi-experiment methods. This is, of course, against the idea of using structural models, but this kind of approach is very popular, and we have a lot of econometricians that use this method in order to answer the questions that are stated by economists and political decisors. Okay, so this is just to have some comments about this. Thank you.
Thank you. I remind that for our friends to join Professor Orsi is Professor of Economics at University of Bologna. And now I have the pleasure to give the floor to Emiliano Ippoliti, who is Professor of Logic at University of Rome. Please, Emiliano, you have the floor.
No.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Thank you, Angelo, and thank you very much. Thank you all very much for your very interesting, thoughtful talks. And just 2 points to share with Professor Fujun. And the first one is about the idea of Metaheuristic theory. And so my question is about the idea, the notion of heuristics that you have in mind, in the sense that we have at least two senses of heuristics going on actually in science, and we have, I mean, the traditional one in economics, Kahneman-Tversky, and so heuristics in that sense is a kind of inferential shortcuts to a kind of useful inference, so conclusion, and the other one is in philosophy science, the idea that heuristics is a way of producing new hypotheses. And so the main differences in these two streams is that in the first case, Kahneman-Tversky, a heuristic is a way of choosing options that you have already produced in an inferential way. While in the other stream, the idea is that heuristic procedure is a way of producing a new option, and so to come up with a new option. So my question is about this point, and maybe that could help to structure further your theory. And the second one is about your equations, and thinking of the way you connect the several parts of economics. I was wondering if you have a way of considering the interplay between economy and financial systems, in the sense that economic growth can be deeply affected by the way financial markets are designed. And we have some evidence that the economic structure of a country has something to do with the financial structure of that country, and there must be a kind of fit between them in order to produce a stable and real growth. And so my question is about this point, in the sense, I would like to know if you have an idea about how to incorporate this relation into your equation. So that's all, and thank you very much again for your interesting comments and talks and whatever. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emiliano. Emiliano launched a few months ago a very good program about the philosophy of finance. He has very good analytical skills as a logician, teaching the same method as me. And now he's trying to apply these skills and the other colleagues to the world of finance. And about the world of finance, we have a fourth intervention by Galeazzo Scarampi del Cairo. We know each other from 40 years and even more. And Galeazzo was a pupil of Sergio Di Cossa at the University of Turin. Di Cossa was one of the top economists in Italy in the last half of the last century. And Galeazzo is working in the finance world, exactly, as an investor and similar. So Galeazzo, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. In fact, you almost, Angelo, thank you for inviting me, and you almost make me sound like an economist, which I'm not, or an econometrician, like the illustrious people we have at the around the table, or a mathematician, even worse. No, in fact, I wanted to thank especially Professor Orsi and Ippoliti. In the last two interventions almost said the same thing I was trying to say, but in synthesis to Professor Fujun, is exactly that. I noticed with pleasure the fact that you did not mention finance as an issue, as a point, because in fact, the financial markets in general tend to reflect the dynamics of the economy and not vice versa. So there is the question is that, do you have a reason for introducing the financial, not only financial institution, but I would say financial markets into your model or not? I actually was relieved by the fact that you don't, because it's too easy today to say, oh, look how big the numbers are, how much finance there is, but the relationship between the size of a financial market or financial transactions and the economy, it's a relationship that changes over time. So if we start thinking that we know what the relationship should be, we go back to the same old mistake of saying that there is a right natural rate of interest, that banking is a bad business and we should limit banking because otherwise it's going to corrupt the real economy. So I'm just saying, how do you see, Professor Fujun, the financial markets into these equations, or hopefully you leave them out for the time being? Thank you.
Thank you, Galeazzo. Now I think we have to conclude. I give the floor first to our guest, or not a guest, because he's a member of the Academy. Fujun, and then to Roberto. Please, Fujun, you have the floor.
Let me do the finance first. That has something to do with the word I use, heuristic. For each key variables, you look at a set of variables, then you're looking at subsets, subsets, subsets. Finance would sit between two key variables, institutional arrangements hierarchical, institutional arrangements horizontal. Then you need to add the elements of time and the space. What I mean by space first is you can do finance domestically. You can also do finance globally. Space is different. But when you do finance globally, there is a danger of a misalignment between the speed of capital and the speed of labor. And that from there you can infer there will be source of tension over time if there is enough accumulation of tensions. Now, globally, the global financial institution, when you look at the hierarchical institution, is dominated by the United States. But capital now is global. Power tend to be regional and at times local. That would generate tensions. Empirically, I'm not sure what is the implication for the model. Probably I haven't tried that out yet. So probably it would be very sensitive, but conceptually, I sort of can think of its relationship between hierarchy and markets. And then you need to add time and space as a subset of that. But then when you relate the second equation with the first equation, the physical one, finance ultimately would have a fit between ideas driven by mathematics with underlying assets, which to me should be physical. If you have a gross mismatch between the physical underlying assets, only you have mathematics that would over time spell problems for finance. Explicitly, yes, I have to say I haven't modeled that into the equation I sort of build up. So this is my comments on finance. Going back to the question about metaheuristic, meta is sort of overarching, okay? Metaphysics, physics, overarching sort of. Heuristic, the first is, well, this model is not deterministic. It's highly probabilistic. But for us to do social science to begin with, it's highly probabilistic. But to add to that, I write an equation. This is a GDP per capita, and you can rank GDP per capita of all countries. And that itself will give insights for those developing countries. When I move to this side of the equation, a list of causes, probably there are shortfalls, okay? So this is a heuristic, 2 parts. Philosophically, for most of the people to learn, it's inductive heuristic, not deductive. This is also heuristic. This is a lesson we also learn, well, at least the way I look at a theory of learning when we saw the brain science is a highly inductive. We use of eyes. Then probably we have algorithms to process and go deeper. That probably has much to do with the language we use. Some language are more rule-based, others are more graphic. Chinese language is probably very, it's very graphic, and that tend to be heuristic. Our way of looking at the world is heuristic, it's holistic rather than analytical. And moving to the question of empirical. I show you an illustration of the multiple questions I run, but what I use to sort of choose key variables, it's driven by theory in a way. Okay? The first equation actually is the Cobo-Douglas production function without a micro foundation, without the institutional setting. Then the second equation is, well, you have a bunch of theories to support that. Why rule of law? Why the market? Adam Smith, you can begin with that. And when I look at social capital, the current way of saying social capital tend to be one-way positive, but I have also done empirical tests of that. Beyond a certain threshold, social capital probably would deter long-distance market. After all, we are biologists. There is 24 hours of a day. So to stretch out in terms of market distance, a better way, instead of sort of our own way of looking at, well, we need to be backed up by a more abstract institution called the rule of law, so that we can deal with strangers, not always with friends. So three stuff, the last one is arguable. When people do social capital, they tend to say, oh, social capital facilitate. But I would argue, yes, to a certain extent. Beyond threshold, probably it's not. Village economy, okay, very thick social capital, but it's not global economy. For each variables, at least at a general level of sets, I run individually different equations. It's all positive, so no question. I haven't spelled out the long name of those who accumulate the data for us, adding our own survey. It's a long list of organizations, OECD, World Bank, social science, polity 4, then sort of 10K top scientists globally, and you can distribute that and run regressions. The results all come back to validate with a very high level of significance and big R squares. I choose 3 ideas: rule of law, market, 80%. It's very interesting. Then the first one, it's most exciting. It's the deepest cause for economic growth, but so dramatic at times it can give shock waves. The growth part is a human brain, it's knowledge, scientific knowledge. We as an animal, it's unique. The brain is so powerful, physically we are not in a way. But why shocks? My sort of initial short answer to that is we now experience shocks 2 parts. Even when we hold the probability of having new ideas constant, randomness a constant. In other words, there is no jumps in our brains. We continue to learn gradually. But the market size, because of globalization, has gone up so much. And historically, we do not have that. And it's also because of a new variable, internet. You can spread those ideas so rapidly. Well, of course, the market, the idea itself probably won't give a short waves to the economy. But when you develop products, entrepreneur develop products, and you spread that, and that probably can go significant distance to explain shocks. It's sort of the high level of dynamics of Schumpeterian innovation, creative destruction because of the market size. That's my sort of initial way to explain that. And when I factor those into the 4 equations, the ideas, I would sort of look at the last equation, from Homo sapien to Homo deus. Then the second equation, incentives, it's not just local incentives. Look at the global financial markets. Okay, they become too rich in a way. Then institutions, in a way, because of globalization, the extreme case is to say the world is flat. But when you look very carefully, it's not flat. It's still curves. It's bumpy. Then the last one is the physical one, because when you physics, it's the difference between art and artwork. Art is an idea to me. Artwork, you need to have the physical base to support it. Even music vibrates physical. Artwork, dancing, sort of. So that's the way I look at the questions. Very good questions. But I still think these are questions within the framework, what I would call meta-heuristic framework. I haven't done much, well, in this presentation about how to look at the theories, the theoretical framework, and translate those into strategy and the policy. Roberto mentioned that, and I was very happy to see that, but I think we complement each other. And the policy has to be embedded in a way. Strategy has to be embedded. You need to contextualize, but at a deeper level of contextualization is a policy. So it's theory, strategy, policy. Probably it's, well, China in the past 40 years has much to do with the strategy. Italians' economy tend to be mature. So what you do is you do not have a grand strategies. It's just market economy, and you need to, you have a space for policies. But in China, coming from a central planning system, going towards a market, you need to have a strategy. And one key variant is we probably are sensitive to the speed of learning. Shock therapy probably won't work. It's gradual learning, modeling first, inductive. See something work, you scale up a little bit, scale up a little bit. So it's very inductive. That's why I also use heuristic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Curzio. Now, Roberto, and then we conclude.
Well, thank you, Angelo. Well, all what I can say is just that we had an astonishing instance of brainstorming today, actually. I think I must first of all express my gratitude to you and to the Bologna Academy of Sciences, actually, for having made this possible. In substantive terms, it seems to me that there are very interesting lines of convergence between all what was said by the three speakers and by quite a few of the people taking part in the discussions. May I just say, for instance, that I was actually very much impressed by the common emphasis by Professor Fujun and Professor Quadrio Curzio on the role of complementarities and mismatches. Of course, mismatches and complementarities are two sides of the same coin, and they both emphasize that. Also very important and interesting what Quadrio Curzio mentioned about the role of revolutions, independence of complementarities. But actually, this is a point which in a different language was also mentioned in what I thought was the very interesting intervention by Professor Fabio Pamolli, when he emphasized the role of and the importance of analyzing something that perhaps Herbert Simon had not really emphasized, namely the transition from one architectural complexity to another architectural complexity. And well, trying to sum it up, it seems to me that all these points again turn around the issue of the role of invariances and at the same time the relativity of invariances. Relativities in terms of the time horizon we consider to be central, for instance, device a particular strategy. And if I am allowed also a kind of methodological remark, from a more abstract or methodological point of view, I think that what comes out of this meeting is the important role of granularity, which was mentioned, and I would say more generally of discrete modeling. It seems to me that all this came out quite forcefully in our discussion. And in economic theory, actually, this idea of the transitional path between what in Simon's term, what we would call from one architectural complexity to another, was precisely what John Hicks had in mind when in the very late phase of his life, he happened to be interested no longer in equilibrium, but in traverses, namely in transitional paths, where the role of what he calls sequential causality and actually of a kind of ordering of motions became quite central. So altogether, I think we are circling around the same set of problems and hopefully also outlining some frontier for research. Thanks.
Thank you, Roberto. I have to close because for Fujun now is 9:30 in the evening. I don't want to spoil his dinner too much. I thank him so much, especially I thank him, of course. I thank all the other participants too, and the wonderful interventions. And this is the first real step of the cooperation between the University of Peking and our academy. And I think that it was a wonderful event. We understand each other. As you know, I know Professor Fujun for many years. He's also a member of Aspen Institute Italy, as Professor Quadrio Curzio reminded. So always I'm listening to him. I learned about economics, which is not my field. And I learned also about how his mind is putting together the West and the East, how he's taking the basic fundamentals of Chinese culture and the view of the world, combining with the Western view of the world in a global view, which is what we need today in these times of globalization. And I think this is another important issue of Professor Fujun's speech behind the technical points, which are also very, very interesting. So many thanks, Fujun. Many thanks to Roberto. Many thanks, of course, to Alberto. Quadrio Curzio, many thanks to all participants, and to see you next time. Thank you.
See you, everyone. I hope that I will see you physically, either here in Beijing or there in Italy.
Thank you so much. I hope the same.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Petroni, for having organized such important meeting. Thank you to Fujun, who is a friend of Italy and especially a friend of Aspen, isn't it? And to Roberto Scazzieri, to the others. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye. Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.